But urbanisation is really exciting. Smart cities, the number of sessions I go to and talk at on smart cities, about the green economy, about clusters of economic activity, about an enabling environment, about the importance of transport. My own experience in London, as well as elsewhere, is that transport can transform more so than most people realise. Economists will give you a cost-benefit analysis of why it shouldn't be built. Just build it. Once it's built, people move, people live, houses are built, companies come, tax revenues pick up. Infrastructure on the hard side is energy, rail, road and housing. And within that, Nigeria, I think, can play a leading role within the low carbon energy systems. Oil, very important, baseload high. But the idea is to have new developments that become as transformative in energy as mobile was for telecommunications. That's hard, focus on it. But let's not forget soft and institutional infrastructure. Soft infrastructure is about the need to develop the quality and the education of people to deepen and broaden skill sets. At the beginning, it was talked about the need to have better literacy rates in terms of understanding pensions. But it's more general than that and more specific in some respects. It's about putting more money into the whole skill set. Education, apprenticeships. This has a big impact. And then there's institutional, often overlooked but vital. Openness and transparency are key. Strong institutions allow confidence, they enable growth, and they provide a great investment climate because they create stability. It's about, as the Director General touched on, regulations, rules, and also law. Oversight is important, but not micromanaging. I think you should be proud of PENCOM, quite frankly, to have started in 2004 and to have the level of assets of close to 5 trillion already is quite an achievement. But it's also quite interesting. Technology, which I notice is on the couple of sessions at this conference, is very exciting and very key. In London and in Singapore, I've been to events on financial technology. London is the biggest financial centre in the world, and fintech is seen as one of the big clusters of activity. And it's like many of these things, you know it in broad terms, but you don't know how it will play out. But what's happening is it's allowing new entrants to come in. But the key thing in terms of the pension industry is to leverage off those fine fintech changes, because it allows you to access a greater audience. It makes things more transferable, more visible, and potentially more understandable. Linked to this, of course, is the need to make sure that pension development goes alongside building deeper and broader local markets, local capital markets. Again, it's a thing I've been talking about in the Middle East and elsewhere. I was speaking to the chief executive of the stock exchange before I came in here this morning, your own stock exchange, and it was interesting. Obviously, like all stock exchanges, market cap has been hit recently. But 70 to 75% of the holders of equities here are locals. Turnover by locals is less, at 45%. But to have a high proportion of buy-in by locals into a stock exchange is a positive basis on which to build. We also need to move this alongside going hand in hand with raising tax revenue powers to address wider tax rising across the economy so the economy has more resilience. And also it goes hand in hand with financial inclusion. I remember presenting a paper at the Commonwealth Finance Ministers Conference a few years ago about financial inclusion. And my feeling is that savings for pensions, banking the unbanked, and taxing the untaxed is all part of helping the working poor. But to do that, you need to allow them to understand how this can benefit them. And this links directly into pensions. You have a young population. But let's be quite frank, pensions are not always the most sexy thing. So for younger people, and I was younger once, hard to believe, pensions can be quite boring. A real challenge is to make pensions become sexy, and the combination of technology, openness, and also to show the impact of pensions in terms of having quick wins for the economy, I think is important. And this leads on to the crux of the issue, I think, for the next 2 days. How we can make pensions work both for those people who put their money into the pension system and for the economy as a whole. Demographics is a dividend if you plan for it. Demographics is a disaster if you don't. Young populations provide the dividend if we make the necessary decisions now. The savings gap in Nigeria points to the need to build a pool of domestic savings. It points to the need, as many have pointed out, to build a pension pot where future assets match future liabilities. There are challenges. As the World Bank has pointed out, current elderly across Africa, not just Nigeria, are already poor, and that needs to be addressed. There's also the issue about the informality of parts of the economy in Nigeria and elsewhere. The challenge is that agriculture and the informal sectors mean that earnings are intermittent and low, and there's little room to save. But the growing service sector, the growing urbanisation, and the growing amounts that people spend on mobile phones suggest it is about making sure you have the right administration in place to actually reach out to address all the people. It goes, as I say, hand in hand with taxing more, engaging people more. But there is a big fiduciary responsibility where the funds that invest need to maximise the return for their savers. But a few years ago, the debate in the sovereign wealth fund area was similar to this. I remember testifying to Congress and Senate about sovereign wealth funds, and it was all very negative. And yet went back to the OECD, and there was a whole session about how you move from addressing these issues, as they did with sovereign wealth funds, through the Santiago principles, but also at the same time when national populations became more aware of sovereign wealth funds, how you started to use some of that money for a development agenda at home. Now, of course, sovereign wealth funds are owned by, or run by governments, ultimately owned by the people. Pension funds are owned by the savers. So there is a greater fiduciary challenge. But you will not be the first economy to face this challenge. Britain, despite having the biggest global financial centre, has this as a big problem. In Britain, pension funds do not, in the eyes of politicians and policymakers, invest enough in UK infrastructure. Australian pension funds, Canadian pension funds, and some continental European funds do. In some respects, the issue is about making sure there are future revenue streams, whether it's road or rail. They're much easier. Toll roads, rail, where you collect the fares for the passengers. Then you can have a revenue stream that puts the private sector at ease. Sometimes it's about government guarantees. But there is absolutely no doubt if you have the right government in the pension funds themselves and you have the clear vision about the infrastructure needs, you can actually justifiably have more pension fund money going into the infrastructure. In an economy like Nigeria, with a big informal sector and a previous history of corruption, the incentive to save needs to be made clear. People need to know the story. The narrative can never stop being told. They need to have confidence their money is safe, hence the importance of PENCOM and a sound, independent or semi-independent institution. And in addition to that, people need to see it benefiting their economy now as the money goes into areas such as infrastructure to boost roads, boost transport, enable the private sector. I also like PENCOM's idea that you can draw down for housing once you've established a 10-year or so savings record, because people often think of that as the key thing to save for, not just their pension. My analysis is that Nigeria is on the right road. But the financing gap is not just about boosting domestic savings, it's also about exploiting that global market opportunity. The international market is huge. Across the world, there is an infrastructure boom. Many different countries find it hard to fund their infrastructure. At the Asian Development Bank in 2010, the talk was of Asia having $8 trillion of infrastructure spending over the next decade. The Asian Development Bank did a good job, but the Chinese and others didn't think it was good enough, and they've set up an independent Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It's about trying to really close the gap. So what you can see from elsewhere is that many people are in this challenge, how you actually get the money to be spent on infrastructure. I think what Nigeria clearly needs is a pipeline of infrastructure projects. It needs to have some quick wins in terms of pension fund money being used within terms of infrastructure, and that pipeline to continue, and then of course to get the cost of borrowing low. To compete and to attract international investors and capital to Nigeria, Nigeria needs to tell its story as it is. It's a good one. Like the Qatar 2020 vision, you need to have a clear vision that you can articulate in terms of the roadmap along the way. India issued diaspora bonds to actually attract overseas money from Indians living overseas. Foreign direct investment, inward investment into the whole Nigerian infrastructure stream, and also specialised investment vehicles for foreign investors.